Good evening, everybody. I must say, you are all the brave ones. Most people were deterred by the weather, but you decided that saving the world is much more important. So, thank you very much for turning up and joining us for this very interesting program that we have today. Now, some of you may know that when I was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I made a habit of only conveying 3 points. I can't count beyond three, so I'll make 3 points here. The first point is that uh, I'm here in my capacity as I guess the head of the Asian Peace Program. I think many of you have never heard of it, but we are trying. I mean, we can of course proudly say that thanks to the Asian Peace Program, there have been no wars in Asia, but we're not that bold. But it's a very small program that we have launched 5 years ago to try and ensure that if we're going to achieve the Asian century, the only way to do so is to prevent wars in Asia. And so we come out with, essays, podcasts, discussions to try and keep the subject of peace alive in Asia. And we hope that if you have time, look at our website of the Asian Peace Program. You get a sense of what we're trying to do. The second point I was going to make is to talk about the subject of the day, which is that I'm very happy that Dr. Trita Parsi and Dr. Sarang Shidor came all the way from Washington, D.C. To share with us the results of a study that they have done called the Better Order Project. And I actually had the pleasure of attending one of their meetings, which you very, very nicely convened in Istanbul, one of my favorite cities. And the point about the Better Order Project is that it could not be more timely. You know, we got used to living in a world where certainly the leading countries, especially the United States, believe that a stronger international order was good for the world. I mean, quite often, sometimes they will pay lip service to it, but at least they would pay lip service to it and believe that greater international order is good for the world. I think we now live in very interesting times where I would say it's very difficult to say that the Trump administration favors a rules based order because, as you know, the Trump administration is walking away from some key international institutions like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the Paris Accords, So it's a very unusual situation that we have today. So in a world like this, for someone like the Quincy Institute to, in a sense, swim against the tide and say, hey, we still can create a better order for the world shows, I think, great courage and determination on the part of the Quincy Institute. So we're very happy that they're here to share the results of the work with us. And we have I want you to know that we have two exceptionally distinguished individuals to present the work here. And I'm very pleased now, my third point, to introduce them. Dr. Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. He's an expert on US-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign policy, the geopolitics of the Middle East, and he has been named by the Washingtonian magazine as one of the 25 most influential voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C. And by the way, there are thousands of voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C. To be on the list of the top 25 for 5 years in a row shows how much influence Dr. Trita Parsi has had on the debate in Washington, D.C. He's also taught at Johns Hopkins University, NYU, and George Washington University, and currently teaches at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Now, next to him is Dr. Sarang Shidore. He's the director of the Global South program at the Quincy Institute and a senior non-resident fellow of the Council on Strategic Risks. He's also a member of the adjunct faculty at George Washington University. He's an expert on the geopolitics of the Global South, Asia, and climate change, And he's also he's also widely published in journals like the Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, and South China Morning Post. But he's also had an interesting career. Before that, he had spent more than a decade in engineering and product management in the technology industry. So you have two very interesting individuals here with us. So just very quickly, a note on the program. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes each. And after that, we'll have a discussion among the three of us, and then we'll throw the floor open. So I hope you will think of interesting and challenging questions, because you're very privileged to have two remarkable minds here to share their wisdom and knowledge with us. So with that, Prita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kishore. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. And I want to start off by thanking you, Kishore, and the entire program for the piece that you've created in Asia, in Washington. We recognize it. And thank you as well. You were very humble about your role in the Better Order Project. Kishore actually played a very crucial role in the project, attending one physical meeting, but most of our meetings were on Zoom because we had so many people from different time zones. And the Security Council proposal that we developed is very much based on the work that Kishore had done, his 777 formula. So we're deeply indebted to you and delighted to have the opportunity to be here with all of you to talk about some of these things. I want to also mention that there are copies of the report here at front, so I encourage anyone who wants to read further to grab a copy after the talk. Let me say a couple of things first about the Better Order Project before we go into the substance. We brought together 130 people from 40 different countries, foreign ministers, defense ministers, UN ambassadors, presidents of the UN General Assembly, scholars, to think through what are the most crucial security reforms needed to the security architecture of the world as the world transitions away from unipolarity and towards, whether it's multipolarity or bipolarity, whatever the structure ends up being. What are the things that are needed to be done in order to make sure that A, the transition actually is stable, but also that the end state is one that is stable and that can provide peace and security for the rest of this century. As you know, the current structure of the global order is based on the realities of power from 1945. It's rarely been upgraded since. The world has changed dramatically. Not only since then, just in the last 20 years, if you take a look at how the distribution of power in the system has shifted in dramatic ways, it's in some ways actually quite positive that some of the reforms, such as UN Security Council reform, that was up for a vote back in 2005 and failed, perhaps it was a good thing that it failed, because it would have already been out of date by now if that reform had been conducted back then. We thought that this was very crucial because we saw that there has been an effort deliberately, and at times perhaps less deliberately, to weaken the global governing structure of the world. And this is something I think is very important to understand. This is not something that just started with the Trump administration. If you take a look at what has been happening for the last 15 or so years, we have seen a clear trend in which there's been a hollowing out of international institutions, of international law, and of these different norms that have been so crucial in providing security and stability for the world. And here in particular, I think it's very important to recognize that the very concept of a rules-based international order, which so often is confused with international law and the UN Charter, is actually something very separate. This concept did not come into existence it's about 20 years old. It is not the same as the post-World War II order. And it's in some ways an actual threat to that order, because it's trying to shift an order that is based on laws into an order based on rules. And there's a crucial difference between the two. A law-based order, an international law, is by and large consensual. Countries sign on to agreements. They sign on to treaties. The United States has not signed any treaties for a very long time because of dysfunction in the Senate. But bottom line is that you sign on and you're held to the different treaties and agreements that you agreed to. So, for instance, the United States is not a party to the Rome Statute and the ICC, and as a result, when the ICC issues arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant, the United States is not obligated to act on it. Europe is, because they signed on, but the United States did not. What is the process of making up rules? We know the process of making up laws. Who makes the rules? This is a completely ambiguous, unclear process. Usually what has been happening is a process in which a coalition of the willing are establishing rules with the expectation that this now applies to everyone else. And this creates a very dangerous situation in our view, which we saw long before Trump came in, which is that the United States was increasingly treating the rules-based international order not as a governing structure for the world, but rather as essentially a club. The language that was used in the national security document of 2022 said that countries that subscribe to the rules-based order would also be, the United States would provide it help with protection militarily. So it almost made it sound like a NATO plus, a bloc formation, essentially. And this is very crucial part of the thinking of the Biden administration. This was not accidental. The danger then was, what if other major powers start to pursue their own rules-based orders? What if China or if Russia started to do the same? We would not then only transition to a multipolar world, we would also then potentially transition to a multi-order world, in which you would have competing orders, not in the same way that we had during the Cold War, but in actually much worse than the Cold War, because even during the Cold War, there were clearly two blocks, two orders, but there was a superstructure above that. There was a recognition that the UN Security Council had authority, that it was the ultimate source of binding resolutions that were binding to all members of the UN community. Now we would have a scenario in which you had not a competition for understanding or interpreting different laws, but a competition between completely different sets of laws, which would create a much more unstable situation than what we experienced during the Cold War. Now, with the Trump administration coming in, I don't think you're going to hear them talk about the rules-based order. This was not a terminology that they used at all during their 4 years in office. You will have an even more aggressive assault, I suspect, on many international institutions. Kishore already mentioned that they have walked away from the WHO. There's actually a complete review being conducted at the Trump administration right now to see which treaties they are going to stick to and which ones they're going to walk out of, and there's likely going to be a very significant number that they will walking out of. This is, of course, a tremendously dangerous situation that can be very destabilizing, but I think it's important to recognize that while this is a frontal assault on some of these institutions, prior to that, we had a much more subtle hollowing out of these different institutions that actually has enabled us to be for the Trump administration to do what they're doing right now. Neither of these approaches are going to provide security or stability for the world going forward. There has to be a third way that is approached. And in many ways, it actually is a return to the law-centered order that established the UN in the first place. And it has to be a return to some of the very basics that that order put in place. And there, I think, the promise in many different ways lies not in the sense of expecting that the US will lead, but it will be the fact that countries around the world will have to make a decision if they believe that they're better off without these institutions, or whether they think that those are worth fighting for. I was at a meeting recently in New York, and I'll stop on this note. And there was a very senior UN official in the room with about 20 or 30 Americans who all work on these different issues. And she stopped us at one moment and said, look, you all are talking about it as if we are facing a referendum for the future of the UN. That's not the case. It's not the UN that is about to go under, or even the multilateral system. This is a referendum as to whether the United States wants to stay in the UN or not. But the UN will continue to exist. The multilateral system in various forms will continue to exist because we saw that already in September of last year with the adoption of the Pact of the Future at the Summit of the Future, which was adopted by consensus. It was a clear show of political will and force by the vast majority, in fact, all of the countries of the UN, rejuvenating and recommitting themselves to the law-centered order established by the UN Charter. Essentially, it was an expression of hope, but also of a current reality that even though some countries, very powerful, are willing to walk out, that is not the case when it comes to the majority of countries in the world. But those countries will have to think through very carefully what the infrastructure, what the values, what the norms, what the premises of this future order will be. Otherwise, we will either be in a completely orderless world, or we will be one in which we will have competing orders, which also will be tremendously dangerous. What you will see in the Better Order Project report is 20 proposals along 7 different variables of how we think reforms can be done to make sure that this system survives and prospers. And I look forward to the conversation with you all. And if you take a copy of it and read it and then want to ask any questions, we'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Trita. Round of applause for a wonderfully candid conversation, representation. So, Sarang, now over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kishore. I want to add my thanks to you as well for being such a gracious host, and had the privilege of knowing Kishore for some years, and he's always that. And this has been fantastic coming to the NUS and speaking with all of you today. Trita has already given you the many key points on how and why we need a better order. And he's also touched upon the history of this thing, that the fact that we had in 1945 an order designed, but it was a world where 5 victors of World War II could sit in a room and do it. And we learned from the League of Nations experiment, and we had the UN system. And the second moment of this was, of course, the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapses. And then there's really one country that dominates in the 90s, which is the United States. And many countries, in fact, practically all countries in the world, have kind of reposed their faith in the United States as the leader of the global system. And what we get is a unipolar era of the 90s. And there are rules and laws that emerged from that time. The WTO, for example, comes from that time, just to give one example. So we have had 2 of those phases, but now we stand at the threshold of a third era. We are actually already in it. It's not the threshold. We could argue that it began when the financial crisis came upon us, because the financial crisis coming upon us after the rather disastrous war on terror in the Middle East. And then since then, also the rise, of course, of China, but also a whole host of other countries, in your region being one of the shining exemplars of that, and Singapore itself. What we have now is no longer a world where we can have 5 countries in a room defining what needs to come, or nor, of course, can we have a single state doing that. What we have today is a much more complicated world, even as the international law seems to be under assault. We have many more actors that have a say, and many more actors that have the capability to at least have a veto power, if not always push their proposals forward. So this is where we are. And the big shift is, of course, the vast middle. You see the world beyond the great powers, and you look at Africa, you look at Asia particularly, you look at Latin America, and there's a set of states, particularly middle powers, that are more influential than they have ever been. Many of them were colonies in the 50s or the 40s. In the 90s, they were still trying to rise. They had risen partly. But today, some of them at least have come into their own. In this region, perhaps most of all. And with this kind of a more complex setup, we have more challenges to craft a new order. But the urgency of crafting a new order is also greater, because the problems, as I think Kofi Annan used this term, problems without passports, problems that transcend national borders, like climate change, like pandemics, like global financial crisis. Today is like a virus. It can spread across countries very quickly. These problems are actually more potent and more systemic than they were 50, 70, 100 years ago. So not only do we need to craft a better order, we need to craft it with more players in the room who are demanding to have a say and have the influence to have a say. And we also have to combat the multiplicity of problems that have emerged because of the modern world that we live in, the complexity of technology, of social media, of health crises, of environmental change. So this is where we have to marry the traditional understanding of a better order created through a concert of great powers with the fact that there is a vast middle of the global south, uh, which stretches from Mexico City to Manila, that wants to have a say. And the global south knocks on the door of this existing system, not through military force, but through the fact that they command vast geographies, that they have access to resources that they're increasingly more protective of. As you know, in your own region, Indonesia, with its downstreaming of nickel, but there are many other examples of this. And they're also savvier. They also know how to play the game in the United Nations and global diplomacy. And they have, many cases, quite a substantial middle class. So in the Better Order Project proposals, we have laid out a number of thematic areas which can be addressed through certain proposals. One of the key ones which belong to this problems without passports category is climate change. Climate change is upon us. In Southeast Asia, many cities are under threat from sea level rise. There are also typhoons, as you see in the Philippines. There are droughts. There are potential migrants from climate change that can cross borders, indeed are already crossing borders. And how do we deal with this? With the existing current order is not set up to really address this problem of climate change. We have the UNSC, we have the G20. They don't really represent the countries that are the most affected or are the most vulnerable or are the biggest emitters necessarily, or are sites of innovation. So one of the proposals in the report over there that you should certainly take a look at is creating a new body, what we call the P20. The P20 is a body that is more representative of the problem of climate change, that includes among it not just the established powers, which are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany, but also the biggest emitters, the most vulnerable states, the small island developing states, small city states that may have a very strong presence in innovation, like the one we are in right now, and also one seat for a state that is particularly important for land use and deforestation. So the idea is that together that this empowered set of countries can solve the problem better than even the current process, which is the UNFCCC, which is essentially slowed down in many ways. And you can't relegate it to the UNSC or the G20 quite well, because those bodies don't represent these other countries that need to be in the room, such as vulnerable states or small island states. Along with the P20 proposal, we also have suggestions in terms of what happens to when we are at the frontier of this climate crisis. And perhaps the countries that are most at the frontier are the small island developing states, because they are existentially threatened. In 20, 30, 40 years, many of them will become uninhabitable. Some of them will disappear if we continue emitting as we are at the moment. So one of the proposals in the package is about coming up with an idea of climate resettlement of climate migrants. Can we use the small island states example as a kind of a test bed to imagine a process by which, if we do not get this mitigation problem under control, which seems to be difficult at the moment, intractable in some respects, then we have a pathway for those who are existentially threatened, and perhaps that can be a template. We also speak of regional ordering. The fact that the world is multipolar means that regional organizations are more important now, or they should be more important and more empowered to solve problems like climate change. This is not going to come from top down. And there are many regional organizations that don't hit the headlines, such as SICA or BIMSTEC or AOSIS, Association of Small Island States, or ECOWAS in West Africa. These are fledgling organizations in many ways, weaker, but they're there. They have been around for years. Sometimes they solve problems. They certainly try to do so. They're hampered by capacity. And can we imagine a situation where we don't, since trillions of dollars of transfer from the north to the south are simply not feasible, can we imagine a situation where we have empowered regional bodies that take on this problem of climate security and try to solve it? So these are the sorts of proposals we have laid out on the climate side. There's also a crisis emerging on another front when it comes to the multilateral system, and that's trade. As you know, we have seen a turn towards tariffs. We have seen a turn towards building economic walls coming from the wealthiest countries. And the question is, can we imagine an alternative approach to this where we don't all establish a new norm, as in the 90s, we created a new norm of an open and more integrated global trading order. We don't all align with a new norm of more and more walls and fragmentation of the global trading order. So this is where I think the global south and states that are outside the West, truth be told, can actually keep shoring this order up by saying there may be a tariff regime emerging from certain capitals, but we will keep faith in processes such as RCEP, such as CPTPP and others, with modifications that may be necessary. So I'll stop here and turn it over to Kishore, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Thank you, Sarang. To begin the discussion, one lesson I learned after a few decades in diplomacy is that if you want to get change in the international arena, you require some degree of leadership, certainly by some countries or blocs. And right now, I would say the three potential candidates, the largest players in the international scene, one, of course, is Europe, then is China, and maybe you can consider India. And on Europe, I have a question for both of you. I remember when I was ambassador to the UN from 84 to 89, when Ronald Reagan started his first assault on the United Nations, one of the bravest speeches defending the United Nations was, to my surprise, given by Margaret Thatcher of UK. And she felt the British could stand up and give a different point of view to the Americans, at that time in the 1980s. And then when I became ambassador a second time to the UN, when George W. Bush decided that he wanted to go and attack Iraq, the people of the two countries that stood up to him very strongly, and I must say with great courage, were France and Germany. And so again, demonstrating that Europe could have an independent voice. But as I look back 40 years ago, 20 years ago, Europe could stand and have an independent voice. Today, my sense is that it may be difficult. So how would you assess Europe's capacity to possibly act as a counterbalance and maybe try and tell Donald Trump it's not such a good idea to tear down the World Trade Organization, for example? Would there be any courage in Europe to try and defend the order?
Please. So sadly, I would not necessarily pin my hopes to Europe
Why not?
for saving this, because you're absolutely right. The speech that the French ambassador at the time, Villepin, said gave in the Security Council has become historic. One of the few occasions there ever was applause in the Security Council, which is against the norms there. But that is a Europe that currently doesn't exist, and particularly after 2022, Europe essentially leaped towards far greater dependency on the United States. And I was at Munich when J.D. Vance gave that speech, which was a very clear breakup speech.
You were there.
I was there. Yeah, I was there in the room. And Europe has fundamentally miscalculated. It's not about, and I say this as an American think tank, we want to see greater strategic autonomy in Europe. because we believe that our relationship with Europe will be better, and it will be better for the world when they're not just an annex to the United States, when they have the ability to stand up when we occasionally, not often, but occasionally we have some dumb ideas. And when we do need to have friends that can tell us, don't drive drunk.
Mm.
And that's what Europe did back then. That's not a Europe that exists today because it's become so dependent on the United States, to its own detriment, but also to the detriment of the United States. Now, with the manner in which the Trump administration is not just trying to rebalance the relationship, or at least from the perspective of many Europeans, they perceive the speech that JD gave in Munich as a declaration of animosity towards Europe, that Europe has transitioned, US has transitioned not just from being an ally to being a little bit distant, but actually gone all the way towards becoming a hostile power. This may force Europe to try to stand up against any efforts, whether it's by the US, whether it's by China or any other actor, Russia, to undermine the multilateral system. But we have to be also honest. Europe itself has failed, by and large, when it comes to the multilateral system, because it's talked about the war in Ukraine as being something that determined the future of the global order, the future of the rules-based order, and then were completely silent or even in support of what Israel was doing in Gaza. The credibility of Europe in standing up for this was already damaged then, and then when you had the ICC decision, and Europe fought so hard for the Rome Statute. But the ICC decision comes out, and Germany says that they're going to review what this means. There's nothing to review. This is clear cut. When the ICC issued an arrest warrant on Putin, there was no review needed. It was very clear. The Europeans put a lot of pressure on South Africa not to invite Putin to the BRICS meeting in South Africa because of the obligation that South Africa would have to arrest Putin. And the South Africans managed to find a way not to have Putin there. But now when it came to the same arrest warrants against Gallant and Netanyahu, we saw that Europe wobbled. So we are in a situation right now, I think, frankly, there's a couple of states in the global south that will play the key role in upholding, that still have the credibility to be able to stand up and uphold the international multilateral system, who have not wobbled in the same way. They may not yet be powerful enough, but I think a coalition of those states actually can. That's not to exclude Europe. And that's not also not to exclude the United States in any way, shape, or form. It's just that we're no longer in that world in which whenever the United States is going a little bit off, the Europeans have the ability and the courage to be able to pull it back. I think that world, unfortunately, no longer exists. And having said that, I do want to point out that you have countries like Spain, Ireland, and others who definitely adopted a much more principled position. But it's unfortunately not the common European position. It's not the position of von der Leyen. It's not the position of the EEAS, unfortunately.
Maybe you want to say a word, Sarang, about China or India as a potential leaders.
Yeah, just maybe one comment. I don't work on Europe, but one comment on Europe. It seems to me that this Europe versus US kind of a framing. Perhaps we can add another framing to it, which is the divides within Europe and within the US. I mean, much of this contestation is between two streams of ideology within the West. So this is a intra-Western clash that is occurring, and this intra-Western clash can absorb the West in ways that it simply becomes incapable of being the leader on designing anything new. This is possible. I don't know if it will happen. And then that gets to what Kishore said, then who can step in if this is a scenario? There's no question that China and India, as the two largest countries in the world, have to be a part of that. Without those two, nothing is going to happen. China, obviously, I mean, second largest economy, in some measures the biggest, no question. But India too, as the biggest country in terms of population and a growing economy. And I would say that along with that, there's going to have to be buy-in from other middle powers who may not be as large, but nevertheless regionally are dominant or major. in their own regions. Because we live in such an interconnected world that it cannot be just Asia defining defining this moving forward, because resources, supply chains, trade, commerce, technology, environment transcend continents. And for that, the solutions will have to come from beyond Asia, of course, but also Africa and Latin America.
Yeah. I wonder whether now we can just switch for a while to the UN Security Council, because by the way, I should emphasize the Better Order Project has got proposals in many areas. But one of them is about Security Council reform. And as Trita said, they very kindly tried to build on a suggestion I made in my book, The Great Convergence, for reform of the Security Council on the basis of 777 formula, 7 permanent members, 7 semi-permanent members, and 7 elected members. And the reason why I proposed it that way was that because the one reason why reform didn't happen on the UN Security Council is that for every country that wants to become a new permanent member, there's a neighbor that says, why not me? When Brazil wants to join, Argentina says, why not me? When Germany wants to join, Italy says, why not me? I'll never forget what the Italian ambassador once said at the UN. It's quite memorable what he said. He said, why is everybody pushing for only Germany and Japan to become permanent members? Italy, we lost World War II also. He actually said that. It's on the record. So you can see how there is jealousy. I mean, for Japan is being blocked by South Korea, India is being blocked by Pakistan. So that's why I suggested we have semi-permanent members, so the losers get some kind of win in the Security Council reform. But they've developed that further. So maybe you want to explain to the group here how you might want to advance your proposal for Security Council reform. Let me, just before he speaks, I want to emphasize to you all, the UN Security Council does matter. Its decisions are binding and mandatory on all member states. So this body, unlike most other international bodies, has got real teeth, and therefore reforming the Security Council is actually a very important thing that the world needs to do. So, Trita, over to you.
Yeah, and I want to really emphasize what you said there. This UN Security Council matters tremendously. It's the center point of gravity of the multilateral system. If it ceases to function, and it's not going to collapse, it's just going to sail into irrelevance. If that happens, soon enough, much else of the international multilateral system is likely to collapse. And already now, we are faced with a Security Council that is completely out of sync with the realities of the world. Again, it was formed in 1945, reflecting somewhat accurately the realities of the world back then. But it's not reflecting the realities of the world today. And it's very difficult, extremely difficult to reform it, because the P5, by and large, do not want to see any reforms taking place, because any reforms most likely will bring in additional permanent members. The US, the Russians, many of them are very much against these new permanent members having vetoes. And those who are seeking a position, India, for instance, the Africans are demanding 2 permanent seats. And they say, if there is a veto, then these new permanent members need to have a veto as well. They're not going to accept that there's a new permanent member that is of a lower rank than the existing permanent members. And this is creating a significant deadlock in all of this. But at some point, we're going to reach a situation in which either there is reform or there is collapse and irrelevance of the council. At that point, and it may not be yet, it may be another 10 years before this happens, but at that point, the biggest losers will actually be the P5 themselves. Because if the Security Council actually becomes irrelevant, it's the countries with a veto that lose the most. The other countries didn't have a veto, they're not losing it. But it's the very veto that is embodied in the Security Council that will be lost. And as a result, I am irrationally optimistic about the fact that at some point there will be a reform rather than allowing the body to completely go into oblivion and irrelevance. The proposal we have is looking at several different reforms. First of all, we're expanding it to 23 members from the 15 that exist today. 3 of those would be permanent members, 1 from Asia, 1 from Africa, 1 from Latin America, They would be elected by the General Assembly. So it's not an appointment, it would actually be through an election. Then we add, and this is very much Kishore's idea, a new category, which is called the semi-permanent states. We would have 5 semi-permanent states out of a pool of 20. Those 2 would be elected by the Security Council, and they would be these rising middle powers. It would put them in competition with other semi-permanent middle powers rather than competing with small states. We have a very uneven situation in the UN in which, a small state like Singapore has to compete with Japan to be able to get a seat in the council. This would enable these semi-permanent states to have 2 years on the council every 8 years, which is better than what the best middle power has today. Japan is the one middle power that is elected to the council more often than any other state. It's on the council roughly every 9.5 years. But this would give these states 2 years every 8 years. And it would not be with a veto or anything like that, but it would enable them to be more present in the Security Council than they currently are. And this is very much aimed at making sure that exactly what Kishore said. If India wants in, Pakistan says no. Brazil has opposition from Mexico and Argentina and even Colombia. China doesn't want to see Japan or India. But if you give this other category, then it gives them a consolation prize. They too win something with this reform because Japan is very likely to be one of those semi-permanent states. So is Argentina. So is certainly Italy. They have a good chance of being able to get those seats. Then we're making some reforms to the veto. First is, which on surface may look as nothing, but we're creating a new category, allowing states to not only vote negative, vote positive, or abstain, but also for permanent members to vote negative without a veto. Now, the reason why this is important is because our hope is that the countries that are trying to be elected as permanent states would make a commitment, a real binding commitment that they will not use the veto. Many of them have already said so. We will go there, we want the veto, but we're not going to use it. Well, in the case of Brazil, for instance, they have in their constitution that they cannot impose sanctions on other countries unless it is endorsed by the UN. You could get constitutional changes in countries saying that they're not going to use the veto. But if the only way to vote negative is to veto, then you're essentially saying that these new permanent members can never vote negative. So we're creating a separate category so they can vote negative without invoking the veto. This raises the cost of using the veto, but that's not enough in our view. Something has to be done about the veto. And unfortunately, getting rid of the veto is not a possibility. The P5 would never accept it. But we're creating a system that is called veto plus one. Every veto in the Security Council has to have at least one other member, permanent, non-permanent, semi-permanent, voting with it. If not, if it's a sole veto, then the matter goes to the General Assembly. And 2/3 of the General Assembly can vote to overrule the veto, which then causes the original resolution to pass. This creates a checks and balance between the General Assembly and the Security Council, evens out the power between the two institutions. And if we look back of just what happened in the last couple of years, that would mean that at least 4 of the Gaza resolutions that the US vetoed would have passed, as well as the 2 resolutions on Ukraine that Russia vetoed would have passed, since they were the only countries that actually vetoed it, and they didn't have a single other member voting in favor with them on that issue. We're not saying that this in any way, shape, or form is perfect. We recognize that any solution, any compromise is going to be an ugly compromise, and it's going to have major challenges. But then we're adding one more thing as a final element to make sure that we have greater ability to fix those imperfections. And that is to have an automatic charter review of the UN every 24 years, which coincides with 3 cycles of the semi-permanent states. Right now, we have to have a massive amount of political will to even get to a point of voting on a charter review. Makes it extremely difficult to actually update the charter. And obviously, it shouldn't be too easy, but now it's next to impossible. By having it as an automatic thing, it means that you don't have to muster this political will, and you have a more fluent and cyclical way of being able to address changes that are needed, mindful of the fact that we are in a world that is fast changing. The very same semi-permanent members that get elected to that pool of 20 may not be the next ones that will be voted on 24 years later, because the world is changing so fast. But we need to include those type of mechanisms in the structure in order to make sure that we don't end up in a scenario again in which the only time you actually get some reform is at a moment in which the UN is almost dying or saving. You have to have that level of crisis to be able to get any reforms. And in the long run, that's not going to work. And that's why we're introducing the automatic charter reform.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, and let me ask one more question, and then after that, we'll throw the floor open. Please get your questions ready. You know, in preparation for becoming ambassador to the UN, I read one classic work on the UN called Swords into Plowshares, you know. And I remember what the book described very well was that a large part of the charter of the UN, and in fact, all the institutions, a lot of the drafting was done by very renowned international law scholars who had actually studied this very carefully. And for a long time, there was a very strong group of international law scholars that sort of protected the UN with their scholarship, and they made a big difference. I remember one of the last ones was an American professor called Professor Thomas Frank, who wrote several books on international law. And I'll tell one story about him to show how brave he was. I once, on the eve of the Iraq War, I used to have brainstorming sessions in my New York apartment as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, inviting a crowd of New Yorkers to talk about issues of the day, including the impending American invasion of Iraq. And Tom Frank came for the discussion. And then when the discussion began, Tom Frank asked a very basic question. He said, what is the fundamental difference under international law between the United States invasion of Iraq and Hitler's invasion of Sudetenland? What's the difference? Is there any legal difference? And I can tell you, after he said that, some of the Americans in the room almost wanted to lynch him, you know, to compare the United States to Hitler. But he showed you the courage of international law scholars who spoke out, you know. So, but what I find nowadays is that academia doesn't seem to have the same group, same kind of density or same kind of courage of scholars who are defending the order. What's your sense when you're working on this? Who were the scholars who you feel could sort of you could turn to say, hey, this is what we need to do? Sarah?
Well, I think we are in a period where experts are being, questioned all the time, which is a good thing, which is a good thing in general. But there is a revolt against a certain kind of elite, certain kind of educated elite. And that means that when new rules are written, they will have to be written also by including voices that are not necessarily like Tom Frank. We live in this age of social media now, So that would be my sort of first reaction to it. In terms of the project, though, of course, Trita will add to this for sure, but I would say that we had excellent feedback from folks like yourself, and in the climate space, there were other diplomats as well who had worked on these issues, who understood the practicality of them as well as the urgency of them. And those inputs, were extremely valuable. And I think we value that in our process very much.
Can I give perhaps you may be quite right about the state of international law scholarship in the US. I can't speak to that, but let me say something that I think, again, being irrationally optimistic here, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the most important countries in the world that at the same time has had a very complicated relationship with international law, which is the United States, will evolve in a direction that will be somewhat surprising going forward, in which it will rediscover the need for international law norms and institutions because it is to its own benefit. And the reason I say this is we have now finally a situation in Washington that not only has the Secretary of State clearly stated that the world is no longer unipolar, but if you listen carefully to that interview that Marco Rubio gave, I think it was with ABC or Fox, not only did he say that the world is multipolar, he said unipolarity was an aberration. It was a non-normal state, happened out of happenstance after the Second World War. If you say that the world is if unipolarity is an aberration, that it also means that the fight to retain unipolarity is a losing battle. You are fighting the geopolitical laws of gravity doing so. And if you then recognize that the world is multipolar, you also have to recognize that the ability of the United States to bind countries, constrain rivals and their behavior will be far more limited than it was before. In the past, because of America's unipolar power, it could do so much in constraining the behavior of China, India, Russia, etc. But in a multipolar world, by definition, the United States will have lost a significant amount of that capacity, which then necessitates looking into alternative instruments to be able to bind and constrain the behavior of other states. And there, the multilateral system, international law, and norms are clearly instruments that could be quite helpful and useful to the United States, which essentially means that once you're in a multipolar world, even though the US will remain the most powerful country in the system, it will become a little bit more like a normal country who sees international law very much as an instrument that is crucial for its own security. In the case of the United States, it may still not be as strong as it would be for a smaller country like Singapore, perhaps, but nevertheless quite different from what it has been during a period in which its unipolar position meant that the international law was not particularly necessary for it to achieve its objectives. It was there, it didn't mind it necessarily, but it was never going to allow it to constrain itself. Now the bargain, you constrain yourself a little bit in order for your rivals to be constrained even more, is far more attractive to the United States once that state of multipolarity has truly been internalized. So I think actually we may end up in that scenario, despite the fact that perhaps in academia, the law scholars are not being as bold as they may have been in the past.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope your irrational optimism comes true.